Mr. Azal, I would like to ask you to make some framing remarks on the rise of the Bab at the time. Would you please, incite us about the incidents that took place and gave rise to the rise of the Bab, the primal point, if you like, at the time in Iran?
Okay, well, it was 1,000 years from the beginning of the occultation of the 12th Imam, the beginning of the minor occultation, when Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Askari alayhi salam began his term as the Imam after the death of his father and went into hiding. And there was a 70 plus year term of hiding known as the minor occultation, where in these 70 years he communicated to the Shia faithful through 4 deputies or gates. And this commenced in the year 260 Anno Hijra of the Islamic period, exactly 1,000 years to the day from the beginning of the minor occultation of the 12th Imam. A young merchant from Shiraz, Sayyid family, wrote a commentary for a Shaykhi visitor from the Atabat in Iraq by the name
and
of...
by Sayyid you mean a direct descendant of...
Direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad through the Imams, yes. Yes.
Okay.
Wherein he wrote a commentary for a Shaykhi visitor to his home in Shiraz. A Shaykhi visitor by the name of Mullah Hussein Bushrui. Mullah Hussein Bushrui had been one of the close disciples of the previous leader of the Shaykhi school by the name of Sayyid Kazim Rashdi. And when Sayyid Kazim Rashdi died, unlike his own teacher, Sheikh Ahmed Ahsa'i, he did not appoint a successor, although right after his death in January 1844, several claimants arose claiming to be the legitimate leader of the Shaykhi school. Nevertheless, there were some messianic speculations that the term of teachers of the Shaykhi school, the original teachers of the Shaykhi school, had come to an end, and that there was perhaps an imminent manifestation, the manifestation of the Imam of the age was to occur. And in Shiraz, in May 23rd, 1844, this Shaykhi visitor, Mullah Hussein Bushrui, who was a guest at the home of Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirazi, recognized his host, Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirazi, as being the recipient of some form of revelation. Now, initially...
So, excuse me, so you suggest that they had been on some sort of intentional, volitional quest to find that person in question.
Yeah, there was a vacuum after the death of Sayyid Kazim Rashdi, because there was no successor, no head of the school, whereas the previous succession after the death of Sheikh Ahmed Ahsa'i had been very clear. He had designated Sayyid Kazim Rashdi as a successor. Now, there was no clear line of succession within the Shaykhi school at that time. And the speculation amongst the more radical elements of the school, which included people like Mullah Hussein Bushrui, one of his comrades by the name of Mullah Ali Bastami, and also Tahir Quratul Ain, Zarintaj Barakani, was that there was going to be an epiphany or some form of a theophany to occur. Now, this coincided with the 1,000th year of the commencement of the minor occultation of the 12th Imam. And on the night of 23rd of May 1844, at the request of the guest, Mullah Hussein Bushrui, Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirazi began the composition of a commentary on the Surah of Joseph, known as the Ahsan al-Qasas, the best of stories, Tafsir Surah al-Yusuf, which was not a regular tafsir or commentary, because this text, and you see it beginning from the very first chapter, is actually designed and articulates itself almost in identical terms to the Quran itself. And there was a prophecy by Sheikh Ahmed Ahsa'i himself that had been transmitted through the years to the disciples of the Shaykhi school, that upon his appearance, one of the first things that the promised one would convey to his disciples was precisely a commentary on the 12th surah of the Quran, the commentary on the surah of Joseph. And this is what...
So it was regarded as a criterion to be passed.
One of the criteria. Yes, and what happens in this tafsir Surah Yusuf is that not only do we have a sort of a echo of the Quran itself, but within the text of this very interesting commentary, there is almost a conversation that happens whereby the 12th Imam becomes the kind of epiphanic figure of the text, with the person who is taking notation being Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirazi the Bab. So in other words, just as Muhammad had an alter ego in the form of the Archangel Gabriel, in the text of the al-Asma, which it subsequently became known, this text, the Peerless Names, the hidden Imam, Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Askari, becomes the alter ego of Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirazi, and he is the one that within this text, within the narrative of this text, is conveying the message, as it were, to the faithful about the coming resurrection and apocalypse.
And it was not a bodily resurrection. That was not a physical resurrection. Rather, it was sort of spiritual resurrection.
Well,
containing the characteristics of the hidden Imam.
Well, in the text of the al-Asma, both of them occur simultaneously. There is an anticipation of a physical resurrection, but within the narrative of the physical resurrection, there's quite a very dense narrative of a spiritual or esoteric or botany resurrection simultaneously going on as well. So both are happening.
And Mr. Azal, I would like to ask you another question.
Sure.
Because if you want to bring it into, a social context, how was the movement affected by the social circumstances under which their people were living?
Well, there was lots of social cause. There was a lot of social causality that made Bābism and the claims of the Bāb almost inevitable. One of which was that there was an encroaching European, both Russian and English, British, territorial imperial expansion into that area. These dynasties that were ascendant at the time in the Middle East, the Ottomans and the Qajars in Iran, were basically on the wane and being squeezed out by far more powerful entities, imperial entities. This was affecting the mercantile situation of the local merchants of Iran itself. It was creating tensions of another sort in terms of, for example, the presence of the Ottomans within Iraq had created all kinds of sectarian tensions between the Sunni and the Shia that didn't exist. Then there was the additional problem of these hyper-puritanical Wahhabis who would regularly attack southern Iraq and the caravans of pilgrims going to the Hajj. All of this was kind of a cauldron of sorts that produced a messianic movement. And simultaneously to the Bābi movement, we have a very similar thing happening in China with the Taiping Rebellion. And the founder of that movement, also the Sudanese Mahdi, was contemporaneous to Bābism. So at that time, a lot of these sorts of things was going on. And within Europe itself, if you look, this period of the 1840s was the period where the left Hegelians really came into their own, if you would. And this is where Marxism itself begins to develop within Europe. This very radical, revolutionary, social justice-oriented philosophy under the preeminent left Hegelians of the time, namely Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And all of this was happening at the same time throughout the world. Also in South America, there were lots of national liberation revolutionary movements happening, the Bolivarian movements, etc. All of these were contemporaneous,
Right. And how did the Bāb come to declare his invitation? How did he start, making disciples around Iran?
Well, the disciples happened, the beginning happened on that night of May 23rd, 1844, where he made pretty much a explicit claim to some form of theophanic station to Mullah Hussein Boshrui, and began the composition of at least the very first chapter of the text of the commentary in the Surah of Joseph.
That's true. And how did it happen that his invitation, his claim, had not been taken so seriously in the first place? Then people started,
the claim was taken seriously for a very simple reason, is because Mullah Hussein Boshrui was quite an eminent figure within the Shaykhi camp, and he had with him from Iraq had come other people, and they had been staying in the caravanserai in Shiraz. So when once he made his allegiance to the Bab, it was almost automatic that a number of these also came and became believers in the Bab as well at the same time. And it probably was during a 40-day period, as far as the texts tell us, that the first unit of what the Bab called the letters of the living, Huruf al-Hayy, the first 18 individuals was composed. The last of these individuals was a lay Shaykhi mullah, even younger than the Bab himself, by the name of Mullah Muhammad Ali Barfurushi, who came from a part of Mazandaran in Iran, or at least the outskirts between the borderlines between Khorasan and Mazandaran, in a place called Turbat-e-Haydariye. And he was someone very similar in temperament to the Bab himself, but much younger. The only absent member in this hierarchy was Zarin Taj Baraghani Tahir Quratul Ain, who apparently had sent a letter with Mullah Hussein Boshrui because she anticipated that something was about to happen. And so she sent a letter in advance with Mullah Hussein, who then delivered it to the Bab after he became a believer in the Bab, and she was then included as being one of the members of the Letters of the Living. And this letter...
Right. And a very short excursion, to the philosophy of Shiism. First, these first disciples were all kind of prominent mujtahids.
Yes, they were all prominent. They were all prominent mujtahids and clerics. Yeah, within the Shaykhi school. Yes, yeah.
And this Shaykhi school can be regarded as some spontaneous movement inside Shia mainstream.
Well, I wouldn't say spontaneous. There was also causes for the emergence of the Shaykhi school itself that's quite involved, and various scholars have written about this, about what the pretext and what the seeds of the Shaykhi movement itself was. But basically, what Shaykhism emerges from is within a greater debate that had raged in Shiism for a couple hundred years. And this was a debate and conflict between the Usulis, mujtahids, and their akhbari adversaries. And the Shaykhi school basically emerges at the tail end of this conflict when the Usulis became the winners, and takes the middle approach between these two schools.
And back to the point, sorry, Mr. Azal, back to the point, you mentioned, the Bab came forward, he made a claim, he made 18 disciples, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, from this point, did they start calling upon, the Muslims to recognize their hidden imam?
Yes, they
or
did.
What they did?
What the text of the al-Asma did, first of all, the Bab sent it with one of his letters of the living, who had been one of these companions of Mullah Hussein Boshrui, by the name of Mullah Ali Bastami. He sent a copy of the al-Asma with him to Iraq to basically begin, as it were, the Babi da'wah, the Babi propaganda, if you would, in the Atabad, in the Shiite Holy Land itself. And he was immediately arrested after the diffusion of a few copies of this, because it was basically calling for an insurrection, a kind of an apocalyptic messianic resurrection, that the imminent coming of the hidden imam was at hand. And the way that the text speaks of the Qayyam al-Asma, there is the hidden imam, but there's also his gate. So at least outwardly in the text of the al-Asma, the Bab himself is not explicitly identifying himself as being the hidden Imam, but rather his gate or his remembrance.
Was it a book purported to be some introduction to his
It was a book, yeah. It's a book very much designed like the Quran itself, and it consists of exactly 112 surahs or chapters to the number of verses of the Surah of Joseph itself. And it is quite a hypnotic text. It has all the sonorous, polyvalent language of the Quran, of the classical Arabic of the Quran itself. It's written in the meter of what they call the Saj. And this text cannot be, anyone who reads it cannot fail to see that whoever has written this text is outright claiming some kind of a revelation. And in the text itself, the revelation is coming from the hidden Imam to his gate.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And that got me curious in the first place when I started reading about the Bab and his movement was that the disciples started adopting specific language.
Yes.
On their own. For instance, the Bab rarely mentions any of the disciples by their name. He started giving them.
Yeah, he started bestowing. One of the first things that he did with all of the letters of the living, he started bestowing upon them titles, from that point forward, they were basically known by other community members by their titles. Yes. And
these names, these titles, and his skills with numbers, they were totally rooted in Hurufiyya movement.
Yes, they were totally rooted. No, not the Hurufiyya movement is one of the movements that used the science of the letters or letterism, ilm al-huruf or jaf. And within Bābism, this is quite a very central technique and linguistic kind of approach to the greater question, where the science of letter, which is very Kabbalistic science, is utilized quite a lot. So, for example, people's first names would correspond to a name or attribute of God. So this is the one that the Bab would give them.
Right. So there was a correspondence between their names, and a number touching to the name.
One good example of this is that the name Ali Muhammad, right? The name Ali Muhammad is 202, and it corresponds to Rab, Lord.
Right. And one more thing, before going forward, I would like to know how the Bab claims and teachings were perceived by the mainstream Shiism, in the first place. How did they react to it?
There's quite a lot of studies about this. There's one particular article by Dennis McEwen that was published in 1982. It's called The Early Reactions of the Sheikhis, the Bab and His Claims. And it details very explicitly what happened. There's another article that Mujan Momin did where he analyzed the fatwa that was passed almost immediately after Mullah Ali Bastami started diffusing the text of the al-Asma, which was basically a combined Sunni Shia fatwa against the Bab. So they read this text and they realized what the claim was. But it created quite a stir, especially in Iraq and also in Fars province. And so the word of some kind of a claimant of some sort really exploded pretty fast. It wasn't it wasn't ignored. So once the Bab left Iran, almost immediately, a few months later, with Mullah Muhammad Ali Barfush, and they went for the Hajj. On their way back in 1845, when they got back, they were arrested in the port city of Bushehr, on government orders, and was escorted back by these people back to Shiraz, where then the Bab was put on a sort of an ad hoc trial where he was forced to.
What's his detention? What's his detention down to his claim in Hajj, or because it is speculated that he also made a claim publicly in Hajj that on the hidden Imam he will not been waiting.
The accounts differ. The part where he made a claim at the Hajj is mentioned by Nabil Zarandi, or Pseudo Zarandi, as I call him, in the text of that. There is a mention of some form of letter or correspondence between the Bab and the Sharif of Mecca in other sources. Nuqtat'ul-Kaf is sort of vague about what the Bab actually claimed while he was in Mecca on the Hajj. But there seems to have been some sort of claim that he did make, because some of the texts of that period have survived. For example, the Sahifa Bain al-Haramain, the epistle between two shrines. This is a very important text. It's a text addressed to Mohit Kermani, one of the claimants to the preeminent leadership of the Shaykhi school, where the Bab basically claims to him that he is the voice, or he's the Bab, or gate of the hidden Imam, and that it is contingent on this Shaykhi leader to recognize him. And he details his claims, and it's quite an important text. It's quite long. And then there are other texts from that period, during the Hajj period, letters, shorter letters, few epistles here. So there was quite a lot of activity and correspondence happening while he was in Arabia.
Right. So this anonymous, Bābi Risala, or Qayyum al-Asma, speaks of how during the lesser occultation of the Imam, there appeared the 4 appointed gates, right?
Yes.
While in the greater, occultation, there were in every age gates not appointed by name or connection, until the appearance of 2 further specific gates.
Yes.
In several passages, however, the Bab already identifies himself effectively with the Imam,
yes,
while retaining, his distinction.
But we have to be very careful, because there's a very, very important subtlety in what he is identifying himself. The Bab identifies himself as the return, raj'at, the attributive, archetypal return of the 12th Imam. He doesn't identify himself as the literal appearance of Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Askari. And this is a very important subtle point that both many Shia clerics and especially the Baha'is have gone astray on, because the claims are very nuanced, okay? And there were stages in which he revealed these claims. And the justification for, why there were stages for the revelation of the claims was contextualized by reference to the Hadith Kumail of Ali, which is a very important proof text for Bābism itself, this Hadith Kumail. And so you have to contextualize it within that lens. Otherwise, you don't understand, because there's an esoteric or metaphysical impulse within this. It's not just a social one. There's a metaphysical one itself that, in a sense, is propelling the social movement. And this is what needs to be, correctly contextualized, in my opinion, which some historians have done, a few of them, others haven't. That allows one to gauge exactly what is going on in the mind of the Bab himself, and especially what these early texts are attempting to convey. But one of the things that happened very shortly thereafter is that, some of these Babis, early Babis, began to insert the name of the Bab in the call to prayer, in the Adhan. And this created quite a controversy. The first time they did it was in Shiraz itself. So, for example, the triple call of the call to prayer in Shiite Islam is La ilaha illallah, there's no God but God, and then Ashhadu an Muhammadan Rasulullah, and I testify Muhammad is the messenger of God. And the next one is Ashhadu an Aliyan Waliullah, and I testify that Ali is the providential guide or the vicegerent of God. And then they inserted also in one important instance, Ashhadu an Aliyan qabla Nabil Baba Baqiyatullah, and I testify that Ali before Nabil is the gate to the remnant of God, or the gate of the hidden Imam. And this created a massive controversy in Shiraz, and it was contemporaneous to just before he came back to Iran by one of the letters of the living. And at that point, it was pretty obvious to the authorities that they had a movement on their hands. And this obviously would have, alarmed them.
Okay, so far we realized that before leaving for the Hajj pilgrimage, he had sent instructions to his followers to gather in Karbala to await his arrival there, which would be a signal for the appearance of the Imam and the waging of the final jihad, for reasons, however, for reasons that are, still unclear, but which may be, linked to the arrest and dispatch, the stumble of...
The reasons are known, because he was arrested in Bushehr. He was escorted back to Shiraz after his apparent so-called recantation. He was placed under house arrest. Because
but an incident there, involving some Bābis, including, Bartolushi, who had gone ahead from Bushehr, about mid-June, led the governor of Shiraz to seek the Bāb's arrest, and I suppose taken into custody, while en route from Bushehr at the end of June, and placed under house arrest in his uncle's home, I suppose. The Bāb occupied himself with writing and, with meeting a stream of visitors now making their way to Shiraz, many of them sheikhs from Karbala, and kept in communication with followers in Iran and Iraq. So was he able to direct the course of the growing movement, which had by now taken its name from his, principal title?
Yeah, well, obviously his charisma, that played a huge role. The charisma included things, for example, the Bāb was an autodidact. He had the ability to compose, treatises and works, and, with streams of verses and just amazing doxologies in a very short period of time. For example, he could write, he claims, that he could write up to 5,000 verses, every couple of hours. And these sorts of things were, in the minds of the people at the time, and even in the minds of believers today, the miraculous signs, that are indicating that there is a supernatural power at work here.
Right. So these writings were copied, right? And
these writings were widely copied. They even tried to stop the diffusion and circulation of these writings in Shiraz itself. They failed, and especially when the king agreed to send the son of Ja'far Kashfi, by the name of Wahid Azal, to interview the Bāb, to find out, what was going on, because, not only had the Bāb invited Muhammad Shah Qajar to accept him, but he had also sent independent letters during this time to the Bāb and his prime minister, Haji Mirza Abbasi, to accept his claims. So they sent Wahid Darabi, or the son of Ja'far Kashfi, an eminent philosopher of the age, non-Shaykhi, to interview the Bāb. And so he went to Shiraz, and he interviewed the Bāb, with the intention of refuting him, and ended up becoming a believer. And this was a big deal, because, Sayyid Yahya'i Darabi was not a small fish. He was an eminent cleric from an extremely eminent clerical family, who was tied to the royal court in Tehran. And when he became a believer, the movement it just expanded at an exponential rate from that point. But it also then, the situation became extremely dangerous for the Bāb personally. So just after a cholera epidemic broke out in Shiraz, the Bāb used the opportunity to escape Shiraz, and on the invitation of the governor of Isfahan, Manucher Khan Mutamatoleh, he took refuge for a short time in Isfahan.
Right. So, would you please now tell us a little bit about the controversies, usually centered on the figure of Qurratul Ayn in specific, which rocked the Bābi community of Karbala, in the early period. Final appeal was hence made to the Bāb in person. And what was going on then?
Well, the controversies, a lot of these controversies, I believe, have been miscontextualized by Baha'i sources and many modern feminists, okay? When you reconstruct the sources themselves, and this is something that Soraya Adam Bakan has done very meticulously in her dissertation on Qurratul Ayn, We learned that the controversies in Karbala, in the Atabad, around Qurratul Ain, centered around the issue of the Sabiqun, okay, the preceders, the letters of the living, and also about the precise identity of her rank. Because these Sabiqun, or the letters of the living, were seen in the eyes of the Bab, and you see this even in his earliest epistles, to be the return of the 14 infallibles of Shi'ism together with the 4 gates. But those who at this early stage were coming into Bābism were not completely clear about that. So where Qurratul Ain would assert her authority, and would assert her authority in things like, for example, changing elements of the law, or making certain elements of practice more rigorous than they were, or insisting that none of the Shia should wear black anymore because black was the color of the Abbasid. These things would scandalize the entrenched, ecclesiastical order in Karbala, Najaf, and Qazamain. So the controversy surrounded the taking off of the veil thing, I think in a sense has been overstated, because most of the historical evidence that we have about Qurratul Ain's activities is that, she was speaking from behind a screen. And this was quite usual. You had many Shiite Muslim alemas, throughout the ages doing the same thing. So the scandals did not involve apparel. The scandals were political in nature. And even in those letters that Fazil-i-Azal and Iranian, the Baha'i scholar, in the 3rd volume of his Tariq al-Zuhur al-Haq, reproduces, it's very clear that these controversies were primarily political in nature. And it was over the authority of Qurratul Ain as a preeminent leader of the Bābis, the radical faction of the Sheikhis in the Atabad at the time, that she was deliberately changing things. For example, one noted instance is about food, where she had declared, basically haram food from the halal food from the market to be haram, unless they were brought before her gaze to look at, because she was the return of Fatima Zahra alayhi salam.
So she was the return of. Sorry, I have a question, but with growing popularity, and the ease, I suppose the Bab was still able to orchestrate the movements,
Yes.
for which he was considered the figurehead, giving considerable cause for concern to Haji Mirza Ghazi, as you pointed out earlier. At this point, we know that the Russian minister in Tehran, Dolgorov, began to exert pressure, on the Prime Minister.
And they were concerned because
to have the Bab removed from Baku, right?
Because, for a simple reason, is because the Russians had only taken most of the Caucasus, only about 20, 30 years before. And they were faced constantly with revolts, justifiable revolts by the Muslim population in places like Azerbaijan, or, and even the Central Asian republics, especially the areas around the borderlands of either Azerbaijan, Iran, or Khorasan. There was constantly these Muslim revolts, and several of them in previous, like maybe 10, 20 years before, had been messianic in nature.
So it gives him a considerable, and gives him a legitimate concern about the nature of the Bab's claim.
Well, legitimate from their own minds, because they were, hard pressed to try to pacify this Muslim population that never wanted to go under the heel and the boot of the Tsarist Russians, and for good reason. But that was their concern, is because they didn't want some kind of an inflaming of these sorts of passions and ideas within, their own territory.
Okay, and in the pursuit of, the successive incarcerations, what happened to Bab after Makru, after his transformation to Makru?
After his mock kangaroo trial in Tabriz, they, and this was at the insistence of the Russians, they transferred him to a remoter part of Azerbaijan in a place called Shahriq. And that was for the poor purpose so that they would stop a lot of the disciples and a lot of the communication and traffic that they still couldn't stop, even when they incarcerated him in Baku. And they didn't quite manage to stop this because the Bab's charisma and personality was such that he usually would win over his captors. And this happened on several instances documented that we know about. But, they sent him there also to keep him away as far away from the Russian border, because Baku is quite close to the Russian border. It's not that far at all. So that is, he spent the last about year and a half, 18 months to almost 2 years in Shahriq, but he wrote a lot of most important works in Shahriq, the later important works, like the Book of the Five Grades, Kitab Panch'an, was written in Shahriq. The Book of the Names of All Things, Kitab al-Asma kulli shay, was written in Shahriq. The final work was begun in Shahriq, the Hayyak al-Din. All of these, the Talisman of the Religion. The Bayan itself...
And it's all dating back to 1848.
Late 1848, 1840 to 1850, yeah. Because his trial occurred in 1848.
Okay, and during, this period, did he begin, to advance claims even more startling?
Yes, he elevated his claims. So, for example, we have to go back a little bit. So, in 1847, when he was first incarcerated in Baku, he outright wrote a letter to Sheikh Azim Torshizi. The original of this letter actually exists, where he claims outright to be the Mahdi in person, the 12th Imam. But again, we have to be very careful because he is not claiming to be the physical Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Askari. He is claiming to be the return of Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Askari. So to be but in essence, the Mahdi himself.
So he adopted some characteristics, probably surpassing that those of Bab and Naib.
Yes.
Putting together.
But you also have to remember, Bab is, in the early Shia Hadith, is also an epithet of the Imams themselves. And there's a very famous Hadith where Ali, alayhi salam, himself claims to be Babullah. And this is the epithet that the Bab adopts within his Persian Bayan, Babullah, and also the Arabic Bayan, which is later. But this work...
And, sorry, how would you assess, following your explanation, quotes from Mazandarani Zuhur al-Haq, pages 164.
Mm-hmm.
He says, quote, he proclaimed himself the Imam Mahdi in person and announced the abrogation of the laws of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
Unquote. Is that true, or
would you
again,
these Baha'i texts, often make these, uncritical, unequivocal pronouncement, and they lose the context. The Bab declared the abrogation of the Islamic Sharia. Okay, it's very specific what he abrogated. So, for example, he abrogated the form of prayer. Okay, he abrogated the calendar. Okay, those are the things that he abrogated. But if you read both the Arabic and Persian and Arabic bayans from beginning to end very carefully, the entirety of these texts resonate and echo central Shiite Islamic themes. Continue. So none of this has been abrogated. So, what does it mean to abrogate something? Okay, in the eyes of the Bab. What the Bab claims to abrogate are very external things. Okay, forms of things. Right? But the inner essence of Islam, which is Tawheed, is a very fundamental element to the entirety of the message of the Bab. And the name Bayan itself is also a central element in the teachings of the Shiite Imams, because Maqam al-Bayan in the teachings of the 12 Imams, and there's quite a lot of hadith about this, claim that the highest stage of attainment, of mystical attainment, is the Maqam al-Bayan. And it is for this very specific reason where, the Bab submits the very name of his religion based on the highest stage of realization within Shiite esotericism, and gnosis, and mysticism. Right? So these things have to be understood correctly. Now, he didn't claim to be Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Askari in person. This is a point that the Baha'is have deliberately misconstrued. He never claimed to be Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Askari in the flesh. He claimed to be the archetypal return of the 12th Imam. And even in that station of archetypal return, he therefore is the Mahdi and the Qa'im. But this use of the term Qa'im, or the ariser, okay, is one that the Bab applies to, number one, all the prophets, all the Imams. He also uses it for his several of his letters of the living, including Quddus as well as Tahir Qur'at al-Ayn, and also calls his successor Subh-i-Azal by the title Qa'im, and also refers to the future messianic figure of the Bayan as Qa'im. So this was kind of, this concept was kind of decontextualized by the Bab from its immediate kind of boundaries of definition within the Shiite canon of understanding, and expanded to include all kinds of other figures. And the way to understand this concept, one must return to the metaphysics, or rather the theophenology of Bābism and these Bābi texts. Because without a correct and adequate understanding of the Bābi theophenological concepts that are operating with these texts, it's very easy to get lost, like the Baha'is have. And, because this is, the impulse, the fundamental doctrinal impulse of this creed is extremely, is esotericism and Shiite gnosis, Shiite Gnosticism. So you have to approach it from this angle, and from this also then flows their social revolutionary approach to the greater questions.
Okay, and before going over, his time in Tabriz, would you please kindly narrow down the tenets of his teachings, so that we can get an insight from his teachings, the nature of his teachings,
which stages,
elements of teachings.
At which stages? Because at different stages there were different teachings promulgated.
Exactly before being transferred to Tabriz.
Before being transferred to Tabriz, well, let's start at the beginning. At the very beginning, in the al-Asma, there is a insistence that all of the precepts of the Sharia, including those that are recommended, but are not, not voluntary or not obligatory, be implemented by all the Bābis. Okay, so one noted example is, for example, the Bābis would pray not only on one moh or one turba, the little clay tablet that Shiite Muslims pray on, when they go into the prostration, their head rests on. The Bab insisted that that both the nose and the hands must also prostrate on the dust of Karbala, right? Now these already existed in certain elements of Shiite law, but they were considered either mustahab, not necessarily, or optional, as it were. But the Bab made them necessary. Bab made them necessary. There's various other things. So they became quite stringent. Or, for example, another one that is very important, and this has been a controversy within 12 Shiism for a very long time, is about the wearing of the color black. Okay, because in the Shiite Hadith, the Imams themselves speak very sharply against the donning of the color black by Shiites. And the reason for that is because the standards of the Abbasids, their oppressors, were black, right? So the recommended color of the Shia Imams was actually white. But for some reason, over the course of time, and this has been written about recently in a few academic journal articles, the color black became, because of Hussein and the martyrdom of Hussein at Karbala, this color black became associated with Shiism as a color of perpetual mourning. But in the earliest sources, in the earliest Shia Hadith, the Imams were very explicit that they detested this color of apparel. So what the Bab did is that he forbade, the Babis from donning this color black from that point forward. So this is another thing that then distinguished the Babis, especially in places like Yatabad, from other Shiites.
But there is, in a broader context, particularly, taking the philosophy of the Bāb's movement into consideration. I would like to say something, and I'm not sure if you are going to agree, because I suppose it was not only the matter of, some rituals, changing and making small alterations.
No. It was, there was a stage, there was a process going on. There was an evolution of these things. It wasn't, there was different stages where certain things were insistent upon, then abrogated at the next stage. Then we had another stage until, we reached the point of the, what the Bayanis believe is the revelation of the Bayan itself, where then, the basic or final forms of the ritual praxis of the Bayanis from that point forward takes shape. For example, what is the basic form of prayer in the Bayan? Well, the basic form of prayer in the Bayan is basically what most Sufis would be familiar with, and that is zikr. Saying certain names of God a certain number of times. The greeting was changed by the Bāb. For example, in Islam, it's salam alaikum wa alaikum salam. In the Bayan, men say Allahu Akbar, and its response is Allahu Azam, God is great, and God is the most mighty. These are the greetings. For women, Allahu Abha, God is the most splendorous, and its response is Allahu Ajmal, God is the most beautiful.
It was, Mr. Azal, you imply that one can confidently still make a liaison between, the Bāb's claim and Shiism.
Yes, very much so.
So there was no dispute in it. And by the way, how did the politicians of, that period get along with that, because we know that, for instance, not long after his arrival in Sharif, Bāb was brought to Tabriz, temporarily, though, where he was examined by a tribunal of, religious and civil dignitaries, including the conference, who was the governor of Azerbaijan at that time.
Yes.
How did they get to this point? How did they get involved in this?
Well, they got into this point because the movement had expanded, and it had become a threat to the establishment, obviously. And they wanted to ascertain for themselves, basically to rubber stamp whether they were going to put him away as a lunatic, or whether they were going to finally issue his death sentence. But they were also very reluctant, in either of these two decisions. So the trial in Tabriz, from the transcripts, the various transcripts of this trial that have been published in various Qajar Chronicle histories, is that this was a kangaroo trial. In essence, they brought him forward and they mocked him the whole way through. And then afterwards, they gave him the falat, or the bastinado, where they beat his feet, and then sent him to Chehriq. But it was only at the point when the revolts began, and you had several revolts happening. One at Sheikh Tabarsi, beginning in the late summer of 1848, after the conference of Badasht, and then other revolts that then sprang up in Zanjan and then Neyriz, and these shook the foundations of the Qajar state, which even at that time was quite tenuous. One of the
and meanwhile, the hearing was still going on, right?
Yes. Yes.
Because at this hearing, the Bāb made a public claim to be the return of Ibn Imam.
Yeah, he made it clear. The revolts were started contemporaneously to the hearing. Whether they happened as a result of the hearing or not is a good question. But then they sent him away to Chehri and tried to forget about him for the next 2 years. But these revolts of the Bābis, just, especially the one at Sheikh Tabarsi that lasted over 6 months, and lots of people were killed on both sides, both the Bābis and also the government troops that were sent there, to quell the revolt. And then Zanjan, and then finally Neyriz. So they had become a substantial threat to the system at the time. But the fact of the matter is that the harassment and of this movement by the authorities, and particularly the clerical authorities, less so the state authorities of the time.
Right. So,
was of
following to his, bastinado, the Bab recanted his claims.
This is a claim. This is a claim, and the letter.
This is
a claim. The letter. There is also a letter produced. This letter at one point was kept at the Iranian Majlis Library. There's been many scans of this letter. Scholars dispute the authenticity of this letter. But even let us even assume that the Bab actually made this recantation letter. The fact of the matter is that taqiyya, practicing the discipline of the arcane or dissimulation, is a modus operandi of the bayan. So, in the times where your life is under threat and you need to keep the secrets of whether your own station or that of your master or whatever, then you practice this discipline of the arcane. And it can be argued that his recantation also earlier in Shiraz at the Masjid al-Vakil was of the same nature as well. And these things are perfectly understandable given the situation that they were in.
So it bears, a comparison, with that of, the Bab, also an explicit denial of specific, some sort of viceregency, niyabat al-khas on behalf of Imam.
Yeah.
Something the Bab had already denied several times before,
Well, but remember
the implications of his claim.
Yeah. But remember that he made these recantations at a time where he had already elevated his claims. So this is a very interesting point that at least I think one or two scholars have noted, that the recantation that he made in Tabriz, to being the deputy to the hidden imam, it's the same recantation that he'd actually made in Shiraz, was at a time that he was claiming to be the theophany of the divinity. The Nuqta, this is at the point in Tabriz where he was using the title of Nuqtat'ul-Ula, the primal point. So at that point, to claim or recant a position that you had already discarded isn't really a recantation, is it?
Yes, that's true. And by the way, before putting an end on this part of the interview, I would like to ask a question about this point that you mentioned several times all throughout the interview. And you also mentioned the title of the book named Nuqtat'ul-Kaf, the point about Kaf. What is this Kaf and what is the point, and what is the meaning of its point in this context?
Nuqtat'ul-Kaf was the title for this history by Haji Mirza Jani Kashani, was the title that E.G. Brown actually labeled on this history. The book itself doesn't label itself by this title, but I guess what you could say is by calling this text the Nuqtat'ul-Kaf, because Haji Mirza Jani was the Kash from Kashan, he was the point of Kashan as the Babi, as the eminent Babi from that town in the chronicle history of the Babis. But the point, the imagery and the symbolism of the point, the Nuqta, is quite a important Shiite one, given that there's a very important hadith attributed to Ali, where he claims that the entirety of the Quran is contained in the very first chapter of the Quran, Al-Fatiha, and that the entire chapter is contained in the 19 letters of the Bismillah, and that the entire Bismillah is contained within the Ba, the letter Ba, that begins the Bism in the name of, and that E is the dot under the Ba. And so the title of the primal point is basically a nod to this very important hadith attributed to Ali.
Right. So and that's why he called himself the primal point.
And that's why he called himself the primal point. Yeah. As the originator of this what he calls the hierarchy of all things, because remember the Bismillah formula is composed of 19 letters. So in the Bab's Kabbalistic speculation, he represented the first letter of the Bismillah, and the other letters of the living represent the other letters from Ba mean.
So, we have finally, I would like to ask you the final question, very short and quick. The authenticity of the book Nuqtat'ul-Kaf has been verified by historians. Is that true?
The authenticity of let's rephrase this. This book was noticed by E.G. Brown in the late 1890s as a result of research that was going on by A.L.M. Nicolas. These manuscripts had been deposited, two manuscripts of the Nuqtat'ul-Kaf, one defective and one complete, had been deposited or bought by the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris, and E.G. Brown got a copy of these as he was completing his translation of Mirza Ali Hamedani's Tariq al-Jadid. And he looked through it, and it dawned on him that this was an earlier Bābī history. He published the text of it based on, these manuscripts that he had that were available at the time, and this elicited a lot of controversy and reaction by the Baha'is, who attempted to discredit the authenticity of this text. Later on, much later on, and this is probably into the 20th century, a Presbyterian, a Kurdish Presbyterian missionary, I believe, I think he was Sayyid Khan Kurdistani, had bought and amassed a sizable Bābī manuscript, personal library of his own, and within one of the texts that he had was a early manuscript of the Nuqtat'ul-Kaf that is very close to the date that this text was apparently composed. The colophon of this text is around like 1853 or so. Keyvan Milani and Jack McCants wrote an article about this. I have heard, and on very good authority, that there is an even older manuscript of the Nuqtat'ul-Kaf, contemporaneous with this Princeton manuscript of Nuqtat'ul-Kaf, that exists in Qom today within the library of the late Ayatollah Marashi Najafi. And I heard about this from a interested party back in 2003, and apparently this manuscript still exists. So we now have one exemplar of this manuscript that goes back to the 1850s, the early 1850s, and possibly a second one. And this is very important.
So because time and again, the Baha'is,
yeah, the Baha'is
question the authenticity of the book.
The Baha'is attempted to the Baha'is.
May I ask you something? Because
sure.
Was it because, Mr. Azal, because during the book, all throughout the text, not even once, the name of Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri, commonly known as Baha'u'llah, mentioned.
No, it does come up at the end of the text. Towards various points of the text, he does show up as Janab Baha. And, he does show up, but he is not... See, the thing is that what discredits the Baha'i theory about this text being a forgery is that the Baha'is tried to suggest that this whole text was manufactured by the Bayanis, by the Azalis. And that they fed it to E.G. Brown, who then published the text of it with the E.J. Gibb Memorial Series. And basically this was a misinformation campaign by the Bayanis to deceive the world about about Bābism. But the fact of the matter is that there are various places in the text of the Nuqtat'ul-Kaf where Baha'u'llah is actually shown favorably. Obviously, at the tail end of the text, the most preeminent figure of the narrative is Subh-i-Azal himself, as the Bāb's successor. And there's a few very weird, chaotic elements to this text that most Bayanis, for example, would not accept. For example, it claims Haji Mirza Jani, or whoever the author of this text may be, claims that Subh-i-Azal was the promised messianic figure of the Bayan, Man Yusrullah. Whereas, Subh-i-Azal never made that claim. But this is a claim that was made on his behalf in this text. And more than anything, this is what really riled up the Baha'is. Because what the Nuqtat'ul-Kaf represents is a view, kind of a window view to that early period in the 1850s, just after the death of the Bāb, and where the community occurred. And it's an extremely important text, because it shows this very interesting theophanocratic community where people were making multiple claims, where, people were seen to be emanations and theophanies of names of God and various people of the past, etc. And these are the sorts of doctrines that the Baha'is then later on began to sanitize when they constructed their own creed.
So it can be gathered that Baha or Baha'u'llah, was an active Bayani believer, but he didn't,
was active.
make a significant contribution to promote the Bayani.
For the first 11 years, at least in word, Mirza Hussain Ali Baha'u'llah was, on paper anyway, a defender of Subh-i-Azal and the Will and Testament of the Bāb for the first 11 years. Now, during this 11 years, there's a lot of things that also happened on the side where one could maybe glean that he was kind of undermining his younger brother at the same time. But nevertheless, on paper, all of the sources and all of the chronicle histories and all of the responses to the claims of Baha'u'llah by other Bayanis are very unequivocal, and they show with unimpeachable documentation that Baha'u'llah was not only a supporter of Subh-i-Azal, but his foremost guardian protector at the time. But then this changes, and it changes pretty swiftly, at least in public view, right after the murder or assassination of Dayan, which is another very interesting episode.
Which would be the theme of our next episode, maybe.
Sure.
But so for the moment, to make a conclusion, to narrow things down, we can say at this moment, we can say in an account of the Bāb's interrogation, written by Amir Aslan Khan Majid-ud-Dawla, it's stated that following, his claim, following the interrogation, some certain things happened. And, repeated scenes of this kind, where they be allowed, could only lead in one direction. That direction, was further indicated at the gathering of some 80 Bābi activists in, the village of Badasht in Mazandaran. And what was going on there, the gathering?
Well, the gathering is a very interesting story. I mean, I have, in several of my own writings, I have dubbed Badasht the Bābi Alamut. You had the Ismaili, Nizari Ismailis in 1164 with their Imam, Hassan II, who made a proclamation of the Qiyamat. The Qiyamat of these Ismailis was a Batini Qiyamat. And almost identically the same sort of things happened here in Badasht in this summer. But obviously with the Bāb in absentia, the Bāb had sent letters in advance. He had elevated his disciples. For example, Qurratul Ain got the title Baha as well as Tahir at this point, as did Mullah Muhammad Ali Abbar Furushi. He got the title Qudus and other titles. What happened in Badasht was something along the lines of what happened in Alamut, where the Bābis basically proclaimed the age of inner truth. The Bāb had anticipated already in writing the abrogation of the Islamic Sharia in the exoteric form that it existed at the time. So this was, in a sense, the dramaturgy of the Qiyamat itself in the minds of these people occurred in Badasht.
True. Thanks very much indeed.
Very welcome.
Part 1 will be with you, during next episodes. Thanks very much.